Hello, and welcome to the 44th episode of the Pixel Meditations. In this episode, Steve and I return to our hiking series episodes that we have been making recently. Perhaps this episode is one of our more eclectic episodes that we've made. We really wanted to cover a wide range of accomplishments and ideas and really set the stage for how hiking developed during this time. So we start by discussing the philosophical underpinnings of the conservation movement from thinkers such as John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and how their ideas compare and contrast with each other. We talk about the major outdoors accomplishments of this time, such as the summiting of Mount Everest. We get into the development of thru hiking in the United States and sort of why maybe people are so compelled to do these sorts of interesting outdoor feats. We also get into sort of the development of hiking infrastructure, how the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression was really influential in the development of infrastructure during this time, and it continues to be really relevant today. And we get into sort of how hiking is perceived in the modern era, so 2000s until now, and the role of YouTube in particular, and how being connected to the internet has really changed our idea of hiking, and how it's really connecting us in a very unique way with the outdoors in a way that we've never really seen before. So yeah, please enjoy this episode.
Not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again. The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash, and the quick wolf snap. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. All right, welcome to Pixel Meditations, episode 44. We're going back to the world of hiking in the 20th century this time, kind of a ad hoc, unofficial sequel to the last episode. So, Toby, you ready to do this one?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely love these nature episodes. It's a really cool topic. That was a really awesome quote you just read. That was by Jack London. Is that correct?
It's Jack London and Call of the Wild.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, Call of the Wild's like becoming kind of like in the media, I guess, or in the press or whatever. I guess there's a movie coming out. So we'll probably cover that book, pretty soon, maybe.
Yeah, we're going to be outlining some new episodes that could definitely be in there. But before we get back to Jack London and some other books, which we definitely want to do, especially after doing Why We Sleep, let's continue on to hiking in the 20th century. So we're going to start with two very familiar faces here, moving to the U.S. Let's talk about John Muir. We kind of ended the last episode a few episodes ago, hiking then and now. It kind of ended with John Muir, but I think we kind of have to return to him to the start of this episode.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think both of us spoke really fondly of John Muir, and he's such an incredible kind of mainstay in American thought as far as environmentalism is concerned, and especially kind of like the budding idea of kind of conservation and having national parks and really seeking to kind of protect nature. And I think John Muir really stands for kind of like an idealistic view of nature. He really kind of views it as sort of this pure thing that kind of needs to be protected, and we need to limit our activities in protected natural spaces as much as possible. And I think that's kind of like more of where he's coming from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I kind of consider him the spiritual outdoorsman. You know, if you look at all his stuff, he just kind of went outside by himself usually, and he did a lot of writing. He drew pictures of the mountains, and there's a lot of extensive journals and poetry and kind of prose that he's written. And it's really, really an interesting idea that I think gets passed down to other rock climbers and hikers in the 20th century. He's very inspirational. And I mean, he's fought tooth and nail to protect, I think, Yosemite. He had work. I think he basically was the guy who created Yosemite. I mean, he was definitely the biggest advocate for it. I mean, am I wrong on that one?
No, I think you're completely correct. I mean, I think America is really underpinned by this like really kind of deep idea. It's almost like a mythology. This idea of like the American frontier, or like kind of like the American wilderness. And I think people like John Muir are really kind of like the huge spokesman of this kind of like mindset. Like just sort of like this idea that the American West is just this kind of like wild frontier, where nature is kind of unrestrained and kind of freer to do its own thing. Like I think like there was a huge recognition of that during this time. And I think John Muir is also kind of part of the voice that was sort of pushing back against kind of the rampant sort of, human kind of development activities that were going on. Like, like the, buffalo herds were just like, wiped off the face of the planet, and a lot of environmental change was happening at that time. And John Muir is definitely one of those voices that kind of like was kind of singing the song of kind of like the American frontier and like the wilderness, and the idea that we really need to protect these sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you think about this time period in the 1800s and early 1900s, you have two gold rushes. You have the gold rush in the West. You have the gold rush in the Yukon as well. I believe the government was actually like really like subsidizing people to move out west and kind of expand out there and start basically like cities and ranches. And they were really trying to develop this area. And I think that this might come to a fork in the road for John Muir's ideals, where he's like, on the one hand, yes, I want people to spend time with nature. I want us to be in harmony with it. But if we develop this too much, it could be kind of very hazardous and could lead us down a very disastrous path. And I think that's where he started kind of fighting tooth and nail to protect national parks. And there's a couple instances where it's basically just him versus the government. And I mean, which is really crazy to think about, because in the modern day, we don't really have anyone that's quite that strong of a voice that's really in the public eye.
Yeah, for sure. Especially politicians, I think they really have to toe the line between kind of dealing with constituencies that are powerful, and I mean, I feel like often nature and wilderness kind of gets left to the side, or it's just like kind of like a secondary or tertiary concern, and it's not like a primary focus of like any one particular person usually.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I mean, we're probably going to return to that because I think that's a very interesting topic. But I want to kind of, before we kind of move on from John Muir to another figure, John Muir also starts the Sierra Club. Are you familiar with the Sierra Club?
Yeah, for sure. It's like a really important conservation group in America. They're really known for kind of advocacy, and also I think just maintenance of trails, and education and that sort of stuff. At least that's what I'm familiar with them for.
I mean, I think that's part of it, but they were also just giant hiking groups. And originally in the 19th century, they were dominated by basically wealthy white males. And then I think eventually white females were allowed to join the group because there are some prominent female hikers. But they're just like groups of guys that would basically go hike together. And I think as the group evolved, it turned into more of what you were talking about, where they were more advocates for conservation and the protection of nature. But John Muir, I mean, no doubt would have instilled those values into the group in his own way. But let's move to the other side for a second here. John Muir is probably, to a lot of people, second in terms of influence for this period. And the other guy that sort of aligned with John Muir, but also has a different take on nature, would be Teddy Roosevelt. And I don't know. The more I learn about Teddy Roosevelt, the more I'm fascinated by him. He's, like I said, he really is aligned with John Muir, but he's also a little bit antithetical to his beliefs as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it kind of makes sense in a way because Teddy Roosevelt, was a very famous American politician, and as I was saying before, like as a politician and as a person who kind of has to deal with multiple constituencies simultaneously, like you kind of have to I don't know, temper this kind of like very idealistic idea and notion of whatever concept you're talking about. So I think in terms of nature conservation, I think you can really safely say that Teddy Roosevelt stood for pragmatism. So like I think you could say that he's definitely like a huge proponent of protecting nature, having national parks and expanding, that sort of thing. But I think there's also like this idea that there's ways for humans to coexist with nature that are necessary, and we have to tolerate that sort of thing. Like we can't just idealistically, have these spaces where like no people are even allowed to go in there, and then it's just like pure nature and just protect it on that basis alone. Like you have to deal with the society and the economy, and you have to figure out how you can integrate this with the world.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but I think we should talk a little bit about the man behind those principles because it's a little bit hard to understand where he's coming from without understanding his personal life. So, Teddy Roosevelt, sparing the parts we already know, everyone knows about how he's kind of a frail child and he sort of had made his own gym and read. He was a voracious reader. But Teddy Roosevelt loved going into nature, but he was actually a very avid hunter, and he was kind of scientific minded despite the fact that he's not a scientist. Like he took a trip to Africa and he shot a bunch of birds, and he brings them back and he kind of does his own, like he skins them. He's kind of doing his own little dissections and trying to figure out some stuff about the birds anatomically. And so Teddy Roosevelt is kind of on the side of like the hunter slash the rugged outdoorsman. He definitely has an avid love of the outdoors, but he also totally sees how humans can interplay into nature, kind of like you said, and how they sort of have to be involved with it. And I just think there's an element of manliness and sort of the rugged outdoorsman. Like it's a rite of passage for a man to be able to hike or go hunt or fishing and to, use the land responsibly, but to use it nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it kind of follows from certain kind of European notions about nature, where you're figuring out ways to utilize nature as a resource. I think in the early 20th century, there was this idea that you needed to conserve resources or to figure out how to utilize resources sustainably. Especially with things like trees and forests, and they're worried about deforestation. Like during the 19th century in particular, there was a huge reduction in the amount of trees and forests, because they were just raised for various purposes, to supply, material to build cities or to build, ships or, various things like that. And there's this idea in that time period of finding ways to still utilize those resources, but to do it in a kind of a lighter, conservation-minded sort of sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, when you think about it, I think one of the things that makes Roosevelt so amazing is the fact that he actually traveled quite extensively. I think before him, it's not very common that U.S. presidents would have gone into nature, but not even just in nature, to also to other countries. I think Roosevelt had a lot of perspective when it came to nature. He knew what he was protecting. He knew where the damage was being done to forest and to species. And I think that he just, like, I think I read that he was called a forward-looking, like, sportsman, which is kind of a good way to look at him, I think. And yeah, throughout his life, he did a lot of writing. He did a lot of protecting of nature. And I think that the idea is that humans need to use the land. We have to use it responsibly. we're gonna be farming, we're gonna be getting resources, but we can't let these resources deplete. We have to protect them. So we have to use the land. Where John Muir might have said something like, "Well, we shouldn't be really cutting down the forest, and we shouldn't really be exploiting nature for our own like gain and production." I think Roosevelt would have said, "Well, we're gonna have to do some of that. It's kind of unavoidable, but we've got to be responsible about it."
Yeah, for sure. And I think, these two different kind of perspectives really suit each other well. Like, I think it's good to have somebody like John Muir to pull on like kind of the idealism strands and to really kind of focus on the idea that these places are really important, and we really need to find ways to protect them as much as possible. But I think having the pragmatism is also very important, and you cannot just cordon off like huge sections of the country and say that people can't go there, because that's just unrealistic. Like that's not the world we live in. We just need to find ways to be intelligent and to have a lighter touch and to work sustainably. So I think the two go well together. I would say realistically I'm more on the side of Roosevelt, but I really, really appreciate Muir as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that they both agreed there should be national parks. Like, I don't think we do a whole lot of foresting. We don't do a lot of that kind of stuff. And national parks are kind of designated space that are protected. And I think both of them stood for the ideals of keeping national parks. I think those are very important to both these men. I just think that, yeah, like you said, Roosevelt wouldn't have tried to protect just exorbitant amounts of land for basically just spiritual purposes. It seems to me like Muir would have been more friends with someone like, Thoreau or Emerson or the poets, and Roosevelt would have been kind of tramping around with the sportsmen and playing football and hiking, fishing, and I think that they came from different stocks in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, both are really interesting, and I think really it's not even necessarily that they're two completely separate viewpoints. I think one almost follows from the other one. Like, I think you have to have the poets and the idealists, and then as that enters into the society, you have pragmatists like Roosevelt, who can become president, and then they can implement these sort of idealistic notions. But of course, you have to temper that with reality. You can't just come in and just do stuff because that's what your heart says. Even though sometimes I think that would be cool, it's not reality.
No, it's not. I mean, did you hear about the camping trip these two had together?
They had a camping trip. I mean, that's fascinating. It's really cool when you find out that like two famous people like this have actually interacted closely like that. Like, I don't know, what did you hear about a camping trip?
Well, I don't know much about it. I know it happened in 1903. They had a camping trip, and I believe John Muir did it specifically to try to. He wanted to walk with the president. I think he wanted that experience in general, but he was trying to do something to affect Roosevelt's conservation policies. I know there was some kind of political edge to the hiking trip, but I think it was also sort of, wow, you're the president that's championing nature and stuff. I want to go hiking with this man, and I'm sure it must have been. I'm not sure that they would have been best friends, but it seemed like it was a successful camping trip.
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt is really fascinating. Like he's like you said, like he's written a lot of stuff. He wrote a book about his trip to the Amazon rainforest, which he took, which I think is really fascinating. I think I'll eventually read that book. Like, I read some of it, but it's just like it's fascinating just to imagine like the Amazon in the early 20th century. Like, I mean, even just going there, like the impression that must have put on him. I guess the locals tried to really like show off, and they put like a, I don't know, like a giant piece of meat in like the Amazon River, and like piranhas like chewed it up in like a few minutes. I guess, I don't know. I guess there's a backstory of that they purposely like I don't know, like they didn't feed this like little tiny section of piranhas, so they were really like hungry, and then they just like ate this like giant piece of meat like really fast, and it like super impressed Roosevelt to see that. So that kind of like goes to what you're saying about him being like more of like a manly man than like a super idealistic person.
Yeah, for sure. And I think interestingly, I think both of their last trip was actually to the Amazon. I think Muir, I think one of his last hikes, if not his last expedition before he became kind of too frail, was actually to the Amazon as well.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I mean, I think yeah. I mean, the Amazon is just like it's just such an incredible place. Like I think any person that goes there, especially during this time, would just be completely overwhelmed by it's just like just the diversity and how expansive it is, and just yeah, just how incredible that experience would be.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like there's so many parts of the world like that. Like, there's just so many cool places just to check out and see, and you just hope that they're still going to be there in 50 years. But 100 years ago, I mean, damn, they would have been pretty much untouched.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, 100 years ago, the Amazon would have been virtually pristine. So
Okay, well, I mean, we're going to move on a little bit, and that's kind of how we feel like that's a very important kicking off of the century. And of course, in between here's a lot of stuff. You've got a couple world wars. You've got a lot of political turmoil around the world. You've got rapid kind of globalization, not quite like it is today. Do you feel like this kind of trickles into like the following decades, or what kind of happens in the 10s and 20s and 30s and 40s here?
so I think you really see the rapid development of the economy into kind of like a more modern form, especially in the first part of the 20th century. Like the scale of development is just like, yeah, it's kind of like unreal. And I think you see a lot of, the rise of the working class, especially in the 20th century. And it kind of like opens up this idea of kind of leisurely time and recreation. And I think that kind of leads to sort of like the idea of hiking in general. Um, yeah. So like, okay. So like prior to making this episode, we got into like a bit of a discussion about what exactly hiking is. I tend to think that hiking is more of an activity that you do outside that's based on recreation, but you kind of like have like a different idea, right? Like a more general idea.
Well, it's not really that I think that that's an incorrect definition. I have no problem with that definition. I just think that the lines between hiking, trekking, and mountaineering get a little bit blurred. And, when I've been on hikes in the past, this is a conversation that pops up. It's like, are we trekking or are we hiking? They're like, well, we're probably doing both, I guess, But are we mountaineering as well? Because we're hiking, a 12,000-foot mountain. Like, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like, where does hiking stop and something like trekking or mountaineering begin?
Yeah, I mean it's a fair question, and I feel like this is a very human like debate or discussion, because like whatever we do, whatever activity it is, like we have to have a word for it, and we have to like be able to categorize it into something. So this is like kind of like this is kind of like no different. Like we need a word for this thing that we're doing right now, and if it doesn't like fit these like narrow standards, then it's not this thing. It's not hiking or whatever.
You're not hiking. You're trekking right now.
But it's just such a human thing to do, to just be like, you're not hiking, you're mountaineering. Or I mean, so I do agree with you that the lines between these things are kind of gray. But I mean, and it's also okay. Yeah, it's okay to define things however you want. But I mean,
yeah, I mean, like, there's a question, like, would hike if I was walking through a big park, let's say like Central Park in New York City, am I hiking?
I mean, I would say so. Central Park's pretty huge. I would call it like an urban hike.
Yeah, and there certainly are urban hikes, because there's a lot of trails in Taipei where I'm hiking around and I still see the city. Sometimes you're in the ridgeline a little bit and you can't really see any trees, and they're very low altitude hikes, maybe only 500 to 1,000 meters or something, but it is definitely hiking. So I mean, I guess like that's the problem, is you can take hiking to like the least extreme, like walking down the street with like trekking poles, or you could take it to like the most extreme, which is just like extreme mountaineering with like rock climbing and ice climbing and stuff like that. And then I mean, you can kind of debate that those are not hiking, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's kind of like all in the perspective and eye of the beholder, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think that really is kind of what it comes down to. But just maybe sort of like in the interest of having a cool podcast, I think we also wanted to talk about kind of like some of the major outdoors / hiking / mountaineering accomplishments, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, one thing that we covered in our last episode is that in the 19th century, hiking really starts to spike. It starts becoming something that the upper class really starts to enjoy and partake in. And by the time 1900 happens, by the time the 20th century starts, every single mountain range's highest peak has been climbed, except for, or summited, I should say, except for one, and that's the Himalaya. So the Himalayas are a major fascination to hikers from all around the world between around the mid 19th century until they actually get summited in the 1930s and 40s and 50s.
Yeah, I mean the Himalaya are just like, I mean it's just like a really really fascinating story. I mean, there's been several like really interesting books that have been written about, summiting Mount Everest, the personalities involved, and just like the whole like idea of mountaineering during this time is just like, I think it's just extremely captivating and fascinating. I mean, for one thing, what are some of the difficulties of mountaineering? Like, why is it that like this had never been done before, kind of like, the 1950s or like this time period? Like, why do you think that it took so long?
Well, there's definitely some red tape here when it comes to like the government and what's going on there. So I mean, like it wasn't like I think a lot of countries they didn't have free range on just hiking these mountains and going there. They had to deal with the government and they had to deal with an X amount of red tape. So that's definitely part of the story. But of course, the other half part of the story is that the Himalaya are the world's tallest mountains. Many of the tallest peaks are over 8,000 meters,
Hmm.
almost 30,000 feet. Everest is a little bit higher than 29,000 feet. And I mean, the equipment just wasn't good enough to get up there. I think I hike like Aconcagua in the Andes is a relatively mild 7,000 meter hike. Now, obviously, it's still very challenging and it's still very high altitude, but it's a relatively, comparatively, it's not a very technical hike. But you got to consider the fact that the Himalaya were never surveyed, they had never been hiked, and it didn't seem like the locals had really tried to summit these peaks, despite the fact that they lived very high altitude. Like they weren't just being like, oh yeah, we got to go up there tomorrow and get to the summit, and that's one of our goals. So I think the remoteness of the region, the red tape from the government, and just the altitude and the lack of equipment that was the lack of technology at the time. Those are the biggest reasons that the Himalaya had remained relatively unhiked.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily a criticism of the idea of mountaineering. I mean, it's certainly, a fascinating kind of like human tale that these people want to like climb these insanely tall mountains, and it's like so incredibly dangerous and etc. But what do you think about the idea that perhaps this notion of mountaineering or just summiting peaks in general is almost an extension of like kind of like the idea of colonialism, like conquering the environment, like putting your flag on every thing of significance in the world and like saying this is for my country. Like, do you think that it took like this kind of like nationalism, this notion of, I guess you could say, colonialism to kind of enable this motivation to do these things? Or do you think that it's just kind of like the increase of sort of like technology, like oxygen tanks and knowledge, local knowledge, combined with kind of like more professional mountaineers? Like, do you think it's sort of that, or do you think it's like just sort of the nationalism?
I mean, I think there's an element of both. I think on the nationalism side of things, there's a big race for them to get peaks, especially in the Himalaya. It's like I guess there's a lot of pride in your country. And I don't know if you knew this, but with Everest in the first half of the 20th century until it was eventually summited, they only allowed one country a year to actually attempt to climb it. So a country would apply for a permit. Let's say the UK gets the permit in 1950. They may not get another chance to have their team summit this mountain for another 6 years. And in between there, you might have someone like France or Switzerland or Germany. You might have these other countries that are, getting the permits for it. So, I think there's definitely a matter of national pride, and that's probably definitely tied somewhat to the idea of imperialism or colonialism. But I think the other half is just human nature. I think that we want to do. There's going to be people out there, whether you tell them no or whether it's for the individual or for the family or the country, that are just going to do crazy things. I mean, we have records for everything, and people want to become famous. They want to do extreme things. They want to test themselves, and regardless of whether it's colonialism or not, by now there would have definitely been people that had climbed and summited all of the Himalayan peaks even if it hadn't happened in the way that it happened in the 1930s or the 1950s.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just kind of playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. I think it's kind of like, I mean, I think the Nepalese they were pretty shrewd in this because, you know, limiting the access and basically like playing off of these desires of the, you know, kind of like very nationalistic kind of sentiments, like our country wants to do it, we want to do it, and then probably just like making a lot of money off of that. So they probably benefited, you know, from having this kind of like restricted access sort of thing. So I mean, I think there's shrewdness on Nepal's side to some extent.
Well, as I said, just don't forget one little thing to throw in there is like originally people were trying to climb Everest, I believe, from Tibet, but when China took over Tibet in 1950, that just wasn't an option. So they had to go through Nepal after that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some stories about like some guys like trying to just like sneak through the border to like climb the mountain like really fast, like from the Tibetan side, and then like these expeditions like failed. Like I think Tenzing Norgay, so like the Sherpa who summited Everest for the first time with Edmund Hillary, like was a part of one of these like kind of failed like expeditions to just kind of like run in real fast like on the Chinese side.
Damn, yeah. I mean, that's like highly illegal. I think I've heard of a couple people doing that in recent years, and they literally get like tackled and they have like giant fines. It's really like very frowned upon.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would be a really, really bad idea, but
it's very risky.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned to me George Mallory, and I think this guy's like pretty interesting. It's kind of really sad, but I think it also kind of highlights kind of like just the insanity and just danger of this sort of summiting exercise. Like,
yeah.
So why don't you talk about George Mallory a bit? That guy's interesting.
Well, to me, like one of my favorite stories. I'll spare you the other one for now. Maybe it's for a later episode. But Mallory and Irvine's attempts to summit Everest in the early 20s are some of my favorite stories from the 20th century. Just because of, I think there's still just so much mystery. Like we still don't know if they ever made it to the summit or not, and so it just makes for this great mystery story. Regardless of how you look at it, you're like, wow, like we will probably never know if Mallory and Irvine actually reached the peak of Everest or not. But yeah, to go back in history and tell you the story a little bit. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, two British guys, not Irvine himself, but Mallory had 3 expeditions to Everest. The first one, 1921, basically just a survey expedition. He attempts it, I think, in 1922 again, and he has to back down because of the weather. I think they get something like 7,000 meters or something. It's still an extremely high altitude. And then in 1924, they go to hike it again, and Mallory and Irvine make it almost to the top. I think there's something like 300 meters away from the top, and the last photo of them is taken on this nice June day, and then they're just never seen again. And so there's this massive mystery. Did they make it to the top of Everest, or did they die up there? And lo and behold, 10 years later, a hiker finds Andrew Irvine's axe, and it looks like the axe didn't fall. It's been placed there intentionally, like Irvine was going to do some technical hiking or something and just couldn't carry it on beyond that point.
Interesting. And I guess they didn't find Mallory's body for like 75 years or something like that. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I mean, you got to think this is the early 20s, so the technology is like not really in place for anyone to be in the death zone. The death zone is like basically over 8,000 meters. It's the point where basically there's so little oxygen that within minutes you're dizzy, you're disoriented, and it's just not habitable whatsoever. And so, I mean, Irvine and Mallory are doing this right as like oxygen tanks are actually being invented. I'm not even sure if they took oxygen up on their final ascent. I think they did because they found the canisters. But yeah, it's a very, very new technology. In the 1970s, there's a Chinese hiker and he finds a body. He just knows it's an English guy, so he literally wrote Chinese characters in the snow saying like, you know, dead English up there. And so in the 1990s, there was a team of Americans that went to try to uncover the body, and they found the body of George Mallory. They actually identified him. They took stuff out of his pockets. There was like a picture of his wife. There was like some equipment, compass, stuff like that. But they never found the camera, which is what they wanted, because then they might have proof that he had actually summited. And they haven't found Andrew Irvine's body to this day. So there's still a lot of mystery here.
Oh yeah, no, it's a fascinating story, and I mean a bunch of people, have died summiting or attempting to summit Everest over the years, and I guess up there, bodies just kind of freeze and they just kind of like stay in stasis, like they don't really decay. It's kind of crazy. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so many interesting facts about Everest in general. Like also like kind of like the buildup of trash. I don't know. It's just a random fact, but they have to take the trash down because you can't like dig holes easily to like put it in, as far as I know.
Nah, yeah, I think everything's pretty much frozen up there because even EBC, like Everest Base Camp, is I think about 17 or 18,000 feet up there. It's quite tall. So I don't think you can just bury stuff. And nowadays, there's actually queues in line to go up Everest. There's a lot of people
Yeah.
attempting it.
Cues in the yeah, and I think in base camp like you have to pay for like absurd things, like you have to pay for like usage of like a toilet, and it's actually pretty expensive because they don't just want to just leave like human waste like that up there.
Hmm.
I read some stuff about that. Like it's really interesting. Like you actually have to pay like a porter to like deal with your shit.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Everest is like, it's really cool that it exists, but it does seem like it's kind of getting a little bit maybe overexploited nowadays. And if you're really fast through this time period, you should definitely check out the other mountains too, because Everest isn't even the most technically difficult Himalayan climb compared to something like Annapurna or I think even K2.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. That the actual height is really what matters, and not the technicality of the actual climb itself. Well, it's
Yeah,
kind of
it's
typical.
the
The
prestige.
the prestige, yeah,
But I think before we leave Everest, we should probably just talk a little bit about the team that actually summited it.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I kind of I don't know, like I was a little bit skeptical about covering Hillary a lot. Like I thought, I don't know why, but like I'm just like, oh, like early like 20th century, like Europe, or he's actually a New Zealander, like New Zealander mountaineer guy. He's probably like kind of racist or something like that. I don't know why I thought that. Like I have like kind of like a bias against certain types of people like this, but I looked into kind of like everything about Hillary, um, and like he just seems kind of like unimpeachable. Like he's just like his backstory, like it's really great. Like he's from New Zealand. He grew up kind of really appreciating nature in New Zealand. Like he summited some of the peaks in New Zealand, and I think that kind of is sort of what inspired him to do this. And then after summiting Everest with his partner, Tenzing Norgay, who's like I said, he's a Sherpa, and he's kind of like more of like a local figure. Um,
Hmm.
he created like a foundation, and for the Sherpa people, and so like he's definitely grateful for like kind of like the community of people that kind of like enabled him to like get up there, because I think a lot of people, at least initially, like maybe like when this first happened, they really were focused on more of like kind of like the accomplishments of the Hillary side of things, and they kind of like neglected sort of like the more like the local population's role. But I think now like it's very accepted that the Sherpas are really kind of like very relevant for Everest Base Camp and stuff like that, and nobody's gonna like take anything away from like someone like Tenzing Norgay or whatever. So I mean, Hillary like is an amazing figure. Like he did a lot of really good stuff after he summited the peaks. So I really appreciate his story. It's really cool.
Yeah, and just to like let listeners know here, this guy's name is Edmund Hillary. He was a New Zealander who was the first person to summit Everest with Tenzing Norgay. And to me, this is really unfortunate that we have to have this like one person in the spotlight, because there's other mountains like this too, and usually there's a pair of people that will summit these like really tall mountains. But for some reason in society, we're like, why don't we just give the credit to one person? There has to be one person that gets the accomplishments. And I just don't quite understand that mentality. I'm like, why should one guy be honored more than another guy when they're doing it
Yeah.
together?
Yeah, I think initially like they were introduced kind of by the expedition leader. I can't remember his name. He didn't actually summon it, but what was that guy's name? I can't.
I
But
forget his name.
like
He attempted it, right, and he failed.
yeah, he attempted and failed, but he was like the leader of the expedition, and he basically gave Hillary the right, Hillary and Tenzing the right to go and do it and try. But like initially, he stated that they summited the peaks together. Like that was like what he said initially, and then someone probably was just like, well, who did it first? Like right out, like who put their first foot on the peak, and then like I think like Tenzing Norgay said like Edmund and Hillary did, or something like that.
Oh, really?
And yeah, like I think technically, Edmund Hillary is the first, but like they did it together, so it hardly even matters. It's a stupid distinction.
Right. And I mean, this isn't even alone. Like, this isn't a lone incident either. This is like every one of those mountains. You'll see there's a pair, but the credit's always given to one person.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like one of those things. Like everybody's always going to say that like Neil Armstrong was the first person on the moon, and it's so significant. But I mean, of course, you have to talk about Buzz Aldrin too.
Right. That's some hiking in the 20th century right there.
There you go. On the surface of the moon. Oh, what's also really interesting. Okay, so this is it actually. So there's no pictures of Edmund Hillary on the summit for the very first time, and they say this is because Tenzing Norgay didn't have a camera. He didn't know how to work the camera or something like that. So, but there are pictures of Tenzing Norgay, and it's the same thing for Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. Like there's direct pictures of like Aldrin taking pictures of Neil Armstrong taking pictures of Buzz Aldrin, but there's no pictures of Buzz Aldrin taking pictures of Neil Armstrong because he forgot his camera on the freaking space probe or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I know in the case of Edmund Hillary and Everest, he talked about that. He tried to take a picture of the whole panorama. He tried to get the whole panorama, and he did get Tenzing Norgay. And he said he basically, because he had to take off his oxygen mask for a short time, like he said he was really dizzy and just felt horrible after like 5-10 minutes of just being up there. So I mean, yeah, I think you're right. There's no pictorial evidence of his ascent, but you can see Tenzing Norgay because Hillary's taking the photos. Yeah, selfies didn't exist.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. There's no selfies. God damn it. Okay.
I stole your words, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean I was like no selfies. But I mean Everest is a really cool story. I think there's a lot that can be said about it. But I mean it is like a true human accomplishment to reach, kind of like the highest point on like the terrestrial surface of the earth. Like that's pretty big. Like that's a pretty big accomplishment. So I think it really does, to me, it represents kind of just like this peak of like kind of human exploration in the natural world. Like it's just like once you reach that, like you really hit one of the highest points. I mean, there's like the highest peak and then like kind of like the bottom of the ocean. And it's just like, well, those are kind of like the two extremes. So where do you go from here,
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I mean, I really don't think I could summarize that any better. It's sort of like we're going to explore everything, and you don't necessarily have to do it. Like, you could just say, Everest is really tall. No one really has to go up there, but someone is going to. So it sort of represents that human drive to succeed, that human drive for innovation and freshness and newness and pride and glory. And it's sort of just, it's like the height of exploration. One of the pinnacles.
For sure. And I think there is something there's some united kind of sentiment between that and sort of like the idea of the American frontier, kind of like exploring, the West and kind of like going to places where, nobody has. Well, I mean, it's unfair because the Native Americans inhabited North America long before Europeans, but it's just kind of like this idea of pushing into like new frontiers and places where people don't live in mass, and just sort of like doing new things. So yeah, it's like a really cool sentiment, and I think it's really fascinating, and I really love this kind of idea of exploration.
Yeah, me too. So let's go to a new kind of exploration. Sorry, that's like the worst segue of all time.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
No, I do. It's really amazing, but I think let's move on to through hiking, because this is like the exact opposite of kind of Everest. You have Everest, the high altitude, you're drained. through hiking is not really a thing until like the middle of the 20th century, and the Appalachian Trail, and I think even like the Pacific Crest Trail, they're not even started. People don't even start building these things until the 1920s and 1930s, and so this whole idea of through hiking gets really popular in the U.S. anyway around the 1930s. I think the first people that do it, there's some Boy Scouts that supposedly did it first in the 30s. Then there's another guy whose name I can't remember. He actually does the whole through hike. So through hiking is kind of like a really cool thing to me, and it's very modern. It's a very modern style of hiking. And maybe like you said with work and the whole idea that people are working and that people really like they have extra money, they have extra time, and they want to go for personal accomplishment since like society has been fully developed. Maybe through hiking is like probably like the epitome of like the biggest thing you can accomplish via the outdoors right now. I think it's very trendy.
Yeah, it's definitely very trendy, and I think it is really interesting. Like you said, it's just such an incredible feat to have done. The Appalachian Trail, and it is interesting why. Like, why is it such a like well known and well respected kind of activity? Because it's interesting because I mean, really, it's like you're going outside and you're deciding you want to be homeless for like. I don't know what's the average like length of time, like 5 or 6 months or something like that.
The Appalachian Trail, yeah, I think it's somewhere between like 4 and 6 months.
Oh, 4 and 6. Okay, yeah, I mean, and it's fascinating too because you just cover so much land and you really see like a huge amount of the country during this time period. I don't know. It kind of makes me think that like it sort of coincided with kind of peak American nationalism, like in the like that time period, like 30s through the 50s and stuff. Like seeing America as this like integrated like unit of a thing, and like the Appalachian Trail is like a representation of like what that's like to see some huge section of it that's really important. And you're seeing like America. You're not seeing like North America and all these various ecosystems. You're seeing like America, this country or this place. And I don't know, like maybe that's more of like a cynical take on it.
Yeah, I think so. I never took it that cynically.
I mean, I think it's an incredible like just physical feat to be able to be out there and to actually hike like this. I think there's connections to kind of like the idea of the American frontier, kind of being an explorer, kind of like pushing yourself to your maximum limits and to see what you can do. So I think there's that kind of thing as well. But
yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that last part for sure. I mean, I guess I see the Appalachian Trail as sort of like a neo like what am I trying to say here? Neo-romantic movement to sort of like escape the living room, escape the TV, escape the grind of work, and all the threat of war and all the like kind of like globalization that's happening and all the dark times with like modern society advancing. And it's this chance to like basically get to kind of pretend that you're like a caveman or kind of like a nomadic figure. I mean, it's sort of a chance to like reset, right? People that go on these trails, like they have this really hard reset. Like, my life was this, so then I did the Appalachian Trail, and now my life is completely different. And I think it's really a pursuit of spirituality and a pursuit of what makes humans human. We're not supposed to be just sitting in a living room and working in an office all day. We're supposed to be experiencing the thrills of just this just time disappearing and waking up in the morning and seeing how far you're going to walk today and what kind of ecosystems you're going to encounter and what challenges you might encounter. I think it's just that return to the nomadic, the natural, and what makes humans tick.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it, like you said, it really contrasts with sort of like the natural or not the kind of typical like working life of your average American, and it's just like almost like the extreme antithesis of like that, like just like the working man, like 9 to 5, like go home to your picket fenced house and live your like vanilla life. It's just like the extreme opposite, where it's just like very not vanilla. It's very like extreme. You're pushing yourself physically in ways that like few people ever do. And you're just doing something that's just, not common. It's just like something that, something more akin to what our ancestors or what we perceive our ancestors would be doing, which would be like walking, like doing these like huge overland migrations or something like that, like stuff that like people don't even do anymore.
But isn't there a bit of a paradox in what you just said there? Like people are kind of pushing themselves, but when you push yourselves on the trail, it's like some people obviously can't handle the pressure of that much physical work, but most people feel kind of like free, spiritually lifted. Whereas, when they're like waking up to the alarm and, having their morning breakfast and they go to work, I feel like that's like, even though it might not be physically more demanding, it's much more pressure and it feels much more stressful to have that lifestyle that's very controlled and very timed rather than having the kind of quote unquote more arduous walk through the Appalachian Trail. It seems like there's a little bit of a paradox in those words.
No, I completely agree with that. Like, but I think it's sort of like, humans are paradoxical in a way because I think we're really, adapted to survive in very adverse conditions that are, that the conditions want to kill us basically. But our adaptations are so good that we can do that, effectively. And it's where we're supposed to be. Like we're supposed to live in, close to these environmental kind of processes. It's what we're meant to do. What we're not meant to do is sit in gray boxes and stare out, into the abyss and to just wonder about meaning and stuff. Like we're supposed to be doing like things more akin to what our ancestors did. And now that we've moved away from it, like even sitting in a chair for 8 hours is probably just, for our bodies, we know it, like based on, statistics and science, that it's like, it's one of the worst things you can do for your body, just to like sit in a chair for like 8 to 10 hours a day, So like, while of course, like, being like, imagine like being like on the plains, like hunting buffalo or something like that sounds really hard. But I mean, that's what our bodies are meant to do. They're meant to do stuff like that, not to just like sit in a gray box,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of why I read that quote in the beginning of this podcast about the Jack London. He's talking about from Jack London's The Call of the Wild. He's talking about dogs in this case, but I think his whole story is kind of a also a metaphor for how humans live as well. But yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I have a question for you on this. Do you think that there's a part of us that kind of wants to be controlled by nature? Because that's kind of the impression that I get from like people that like to do the thru hiking and people that like to do these really long hikes. Because we're kind of spoon-fed this ideology from modern culture, like you are 100% in control of your life. Whatever you do will dictate the direction of your life, and whatever success you get will come from you, and whatever failures you get will come from you. And people kind of subscribe to this, and then they live these lives just kind of working, and a lot of people just sort of start having like a falling out with that ideology. And I think some people want nature to be in control, not people to be in control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of those ideas going on. Like there's a false notion that like working for a corporation and earning a wage is somehow related to freedom. Like that imparts freedom to you. But living on the land and like being subjected to the the nature, that's not freedom. Like I totally agree with you. Like we're kind of spoon-fed these ideas that are kind of like contradictory. Like it doesn't even make sense really. And I think it's just like so much of our physiology and the way we think is attuned to environmental kind of processes, like flowing with the ebbs and like those natural ebbs and flows. Like it just like works better for us than like to just like be subjected to these artificial constraints, like 9 to 5 work day, etc. like that. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. And because this topic is like wedged inside of a different topic, I think we're probably going to have to move on. But I would really love to return to this topic in a later podcast because I think there is a lot more to talk about here.
Yeah, for sure. It really underpins, I think, just the entire idea of nature and hiking and why people do these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go on YouTube and you watch people who do through hiking, and if you listen to their motivations why, a lot of what we just talked about will resonate with their motivations and their reasons to do the long trails like the Appalachian or the Pacific Crest, or even trails from other countries like Te Araroa in New Zealand.
Represents Continental Divide Trail because it goes through New Mexico. So there you go.
All right, well, let's move on a little bit. So we're talking about development of hiking infrastructure, which is quite important, I think, to the 20th century.
Yeah, for sure. And so I included this section because I think it's just important to kind of frame like how the hiking infrastructure developed in the United States. The biggest thing that I really want to say is that I mean, are you familiar with the like had you heard of the CCC, like the Civilian Conservation Corps?
Now, I hadn't heard of it. I looked it up a little bit. Of course, I've heard of FDR and the New Deal. I just never heard of the CCC as part of that in my education. So this was a new idea to me.
Yeah. So okay. So following the Great Depression and FDR's administration, one of his policies was a work relief program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, along with various other ones. But essentially, he paid like I would say uneducated single like males. I think it's like between the ages of like 17 and like 25 or something like that, like $30 a month, which is not that much even in like $1930 or whatever, to work on like kind of trails and kind of national infrastructure. And it's really a big deal for the West. Like, I don't know if it's such a big deal out East because you guys had already established a lot of stuff and you have like ways of funding a lot of various hiking trails and, you know, other than this. But in terms of like the West, like say like a state like New Mexico, like many trails that are still in New Mexico now were made by the CCC and during this time. So it's actually like a really important part for like, I would say the American West, because in a lot of cases, like this is kind of like the first time that hiking trails are ever made. But anyway, with regards to kind of like this episode, like I think it's cool to kind of just like talk about the idea of having programs that are really kind of like focused on getting people involved in working with nature and hiking in general. And even if it's like government funded, but like as a way to kind of promote the idea of conservation and developing, you know, infrastructure. I think that's really cool, and I would love to see like a resurgence of this kind of thing, you know, in the modern context.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, so it kind of fits that we continue on to FDR later in the episode. And yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that to you on the way back home tonight. I said like, wow, why don't we have stuff like this anymore? I think most like trail maintenance and like cabin maintenance is done by volunteers now, because there's enough people that are just willing to go do that who might be retired or have X amount of money and they don't need to work. And it's kind of more of, I think there's definitely paid staff that does it, but I don't think that, I guess maybe we're just too developed now. Like, I don't know where you would put people, like maybe like Alaska or something, pay them to go up there and like make trails. Like, is it feasible in the modern world?
Yeah. So it's really interesting, but so I'm in Germany right now and they actually have a really cool program that's specifically for this. It's called like their nature year or whatever. It's a voluntary year that you can take after finishing high school and before college, and they will actually pay you money to work for like a nonprofit or like a botanical garden or some kind of nature organization, and you can work for an entire year, and the government will pay them to just kind of like gain these kind of you know, appreciation for like nature and ecosystem and just like skills, outdoor skills. And it's a very popular and common program in Germany that that they still do. So I would love to see something like this, like just like have funding for like a gap year program between high school and university, where like people can just like, if they want, just like go and spend a year in nature, because it's a really valuable thing to like increase awareness, increase appreciation and knowledge for nature. And if we can push that as much as possible to the younger generation, I think that's a really, really good thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think behind that is, of course, that education is really pivotal to increasing environmental awareness, conservation, and pushing forth like stuff like green energy and the battle against global warming. Like education is really going to become key in all of those issues. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to just see that for just high school either. I don't want to just see that for people in high school. I want to see that be an option for anyone. I mean, of course, I think it might be a lot to ask to get paid to work in a botanical garden or something. There's a lot of people in America that might have a grudge against that sort of thing. But I would really love to see that too, and I definitely agree that's an amazing program, and education is one of the most vital steps in teaching people about nature, having them appreciate it, and leading them into careers that might protect it.
Yeah, for sure. I think we just sort of as a society need to move away from the idea that it's just kind of like hippy dippy or whatever. Like these things are really important for everybody. Just sort of like the stability of our country. It's not like some ridiculous hippie notion that we should have sustainable land use or something like that. Like we need to like have like an approach to this that fits the facts. Like we don't need to just like have this the it's just a liberal like philosophy to protect nature. Like like it just needs to become like a more like commonplace idea that's kind of apolitical, because it is apolitical. Like it affects everybody regardless of your political perspective, that this is important.
Yeah, I'm going to join the echo chamber here and just shout out that probably the fact that there's so much money in politics and so much interest by so much corporate interest mixed in at least American politics, that's probably what makes environmental issues seem like they're political rather than apolitical. There's a lot of money being spent for oil companies and a lot of fossil fuel industry,
Yeah.
the fossil fuel industry as a whole, which is really sad. But to you, I mean, like the political spectrum aside, when do you think there's sort of a change? Whereas like a great conservative president like TR can champion um, the the economy as well as nature. Where does this divide and change happen where it suddenly becomes a liberal issue or a tree hugger issue?
Yeah. I mean, I think really it's coincided with honestly the counter, it would be called the counter culture revolution. So the pushback against the hippies during the 60s. Um
Mm-hmm.
so I think for whatever reason, the counterculture movement in the 60s really like hit some cultural nerves with kind of like the more conservative establishment at the time. Um, like because you had these like the rise of kind of like the hippie movement, and they really pushed a very extreme and I would say also idealistic vision of conservation. Um, it was definitely more on the like Muir side than the Teddy Roosevelt side that was pushed,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a very like strong resistance against this, like maybe almost like an overcorrection, and I think it just sort of like turned into like a vilification, of the entire notion of conservation in general. Like you just became a tree hugger, like a bleeding heart liberal tree hugger, and it's interesting because that idea is really from that time. Like if you go back to like the early 20th century, like the idea of a liberal heart tree hugger is non-existent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even though there were very very idealistic nature conservationists around, like John Muir, like nobody called him a tree hugger because that concept didn't exist.
Might it be partially because of the other facets of the counterculture movements? Now, I don't want to get too far into this due to the context of the episode, but might it be because of like all the rock and roll music, which is still kind of fresh, all the drugs they were doing, like mushrooms, psychedelics, marijuana? Might have these things kind of taken away some of their credibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot, and it's a really unfortunate part about the whole counterculture movement is so much of it was subsumed by just the excess of that time. It wasn't like very rational, a lot of it was over the top and to a point that really kind of alienated and pushed back the rest of society. It was just like, it was either just like take our extreme version of these ideas or just like screw you, and that was kind of it.
There's no moderate. There's in that time.
No.
It doesn't
No,
seem
no.
like there's no moderate stance.
No, it doesn't seem like that. It does seem like the idealism kind of got pushed really hard during that time. I mean, and I think there's some good things that came out of that. Did you ever read Silent Spring in one of your classes in your life?
Now, I learned about Rachel Carlson's Silent Springs in one of my classes, like an environmental policy class in my undergrad, but I never actually read the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just like a very common thing to be, to read at least a section of that book. Like various like huge environmental accomplishments. Like we had the development of the EPA, like we have the Endangered Species Act, like we have all these really awesome things that are really important that came out of this like environmental 1960s movement. But at the same time, like it did push a very idealistic idea, and then like you have a pushback that kind of created this idea that environmentalism is sort of like a bleeding heart liberal notion, which is like insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, I understand. It's a very legendary part of the 20th century, and one that I think is still jolting through our generation as well. I mean, I feel like my parents were just born at the time where that was kind of permeating their brains, and my parents were just children at that time, but it's something that's just like underpinned our society since then. It's like this floodgate had opened that is just impossible to shut. It's sort of like a Pandora's box. And I think that like, some of the maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to call them bad parts because I mean, I'm not against drugs or rock and roll music, and I'm certainly not against rock and roll music, but it just seemed like there's a lot of floodgates that were burst open in that time. And it definitely, conservative culture was very negatively impacted, and maybe, like you said, they overcorrected for something. But I want to bring this back to hiking a little bit. So we go into the 70s, 80s, and 90s now, the final decades of the 20th century, and hiking has now become quite marketable. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I think about in this time period is that a lot more people are hiking. It's a lot more accessible to the middle class, and that there's a lot of companies who are marketing hiking products. And it's becoming something that almost everyone can do, not just the upper class or the upper echelons of society.
Yeah, for sure. We're in the era of REI and kind of like hipster like hiking gear and
Fjallraven.
Yeah. I mean, I love REI. It's a great store. It's really amazing. I actually really miss REI. Do they have that out in the East Coast? Maybe not actually.
Yeah, we do. We definitely do.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I like companies like REI are actually really great because they care about kind of like only giving people quality goods and also educating people and not just like trying to like make a buck. So I really respect companies like REI. But yeah, I mean, there's just like a lot of interest in nature and hiking, and it's very marketed. And it's just cool. Like we're in a definitely like a good time for it. But I mean, I think some states are better than others for it. Like New Mexico, unfortunately, just has a lot of very unmaintained, nature areas. You really have to have like a 4-wheel drive vehicle or something like that in a lot of cases. That's why I mentioned like the CCC and stuff, because it is such an important part for like the nature in like New Mexico. But yeah, I mean, places like California, it's like ridiculous how well maintained those trails are out there because it's just like everybody loves them. It's just nutty.
Yeah, well, I mean, Maine's the same way in that like a lot of it's just very rough terrain, and you really do need a 4-wheeler to get into the heart of like where the hiking and the outdoors is. And if you don't have that kind of equipment in a 4-wheeler, you might be in some serious trouble. So I totally understand that I totally understand that point of view and how you guys feel in New Mexico. And I feel like the pre-internet time, like with like my dad, like I don't know, it's really hard for me to look at this objectively because Maine is like a very, very outdoorsy state. Like it's like almost in our blood to be like in the outdoors. And my dad was always like, about camping, and he didn't go hiking. My uncles went hiking and hunting and fishing a lot. My dad was more or less, he was kind of the most tame one. He did more hiking, light hiking, and camping. And I feel like that was kind of very like common in the pre-internet era, that like you sort of like just wing it, like you wing it, like you sort of just grab a tent and you go out there and you do a little bit of camping and you just kind of experience it because you probably read about it in the newspaper or whatnot. But I think the internet has done a huge like maybe service. I would say service, not a disservice. A huge service to outdoors and the hiking community, and just like increasing the capacity for everyone to get involved and everyone to care about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, I just said a lot there.
No. Definitely, it's definitely true for the most part. So in my program here in Germany, I actually went to a national park in the Bavarian National Forest, and I talked to. It's actually I totally agree with you that the internet is generally very, very positive, but it's actually kind of hilarious sometimes how it can be actually a negative thing. So the Bavarian National Forest has many like points in which you can enter the park. But a lot of those parts and areas within the national park are kind of like they're kind of like secret, or like you don't really know like where those access points are. But with the internet, like all that stuff gets put online, and then like so like instead of having only a few places where people come into the national park, like they just coming in from all the sides, and they're just like fully like swarming the national park because they have like access to all this information. And the problem is there's no way for the national park to like maintain all of these different entrances, and they can't close them off either. So it's just like it makes it kind of difficult in that way because like they can't control the information. It's just going to get put out there. So I totally agree that like there's some, I mean, it's like there's some incredible like stuff out there about nature and just appreciating it. And there's a lot of really great like YouTubers like we've mentioned and talked about, like Darwin on the Trail, for example, like a very famous like YouTuber who did like through hiking and the Appalachian Trail and various other things.
Homemade Wanderlust.
Like there's so many great YouTubers, but there's also a downside, like sometimes having too much information given to the general population, and to like basically not allow the authorities to have any control over this information, and it's just like out there, it can be bad too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't think I coined this by any means of the stretch, but we call it like the Instagram hikers. They see a picture and they're like, "Oh man, I'd love to just like put that on my Instagram wall," or I'd love to post that to Instagram. So I'm gonna hike to this really cool spot that I saw someone else go to. And sometimes these hikers get themselves in some deep shit. Like they go into this area that's actually pretty like treacherous, or there's some technical hiking that they're not ready for, and so it can be problematic. But I think this is where it comes down to education. This is where it's really important that people learn stuff like where people first of all learn that hiking and being in the outdoors isn't something you just master with one trip. It's sort of like a ladder, and you got to get better and better at it. You can't just go hiking for 7 days. Your first trip, you're probably going to hate it. You're probably going to just fail hard. And I think that education is huge. And I think that in that way, the internet can be negative in that you want to replicate what other people are doing. You want the same pictures. You want the same experiences. But I think you got to be realistic as well, and maybe that's something that people need to learn.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah, like I think the internet, like in many instances, maybe in all instances, there's a lot of good, but there's also potential bad sides too. But I think generally, like having like a wide, if we have enough good information out there, I think in general the good information is going to like overwhelm the bad, and then overall it's going to be a good thing. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting how much the internet has changed that. Like you never really had people like videos of like actual local people or whatever like walking around like hiking and like talking. Like that's such a new kind of concept, and I think it's a really cool one.
Yeah, I mean stuff with like the GoPro and stuff. It just makes it so much easier to do. And yeah, I mean I remember as a kid because like as a kid, I mean you're kind of like subjected to your parents' sort of experience. And my dad was like a very light outdoorsman. Like I said, he liked to go camping, but he wasn't gonna get his feet too dirty. And so I just thought my uncles were like legends to me. Like they were going out there and like hunting deer and like gutting them. And one of my uncles, he panned for gold for a whole summer, and he could like rip bark off a tree and cook pancakes. And I mean, he was like a disc golf champion in like New England. I mean, he was just like he was such a legend to me. I like even to this day, he's still like the most interesting person to talk to in my family, I'd say. Hope they don't listen to that, but like I don't know, it just seemed like so legendary. It seemed like they were just like living off the grid, and like I think before the internet, that was much more of like I don't know. It just seemed crazier. Maybe that's just because I was a child at that time, and my perspective of the world was just not very developed. But I don't know. I'm just much less impressed nowadays when people do stuff versus back then.
um yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's again like there's good things and bad things. Like I think it is in general very hard to impress people now, because we've seen like everything. There was this it's kind of weird, but like so there's this recent astronaut who was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was like saying that like his first view of Earth from the International Space Station was he was just like his response was meh. It's like, and he said that it was like this because he's just been so exposed to images of the earth and just like what it's like, and just like he feels like it wasn't that impressive to him, like even being there and seeing it. He was just like, okay, whatever. It's like that's
That's
crazy.
crazy. That's crazy. I just can't imagine that.
I know, but it's just like, the amount of media that we consume and just like the general like kind of level of like just ridiculous things that we're constantly exposing ourselves to. Like it is like that though. Like, it becomes progressively harder and harder to actually impress us.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And actually, being in Taiwan, I think it's a very unique situation because it's almost like the information's there, but it's so cryptic. Like when you have to like do a long hike, you got to like go through all these Taiwanese blogs and translate them to English. And then you have all this big broken English on the page that you need to navigate. And it's like this like kind of it's annoying, but it's also kind of magical because you just don't have all the information. It still feels like there's like so much mystery in the hikes when you're in a foreign country and there's not a whole lot of English information on the hikes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a big part of kind of like living in a country where English isn't the main language. Just the experience of it feels like an exploration, like you said. And just like also like if there's just like a lot of customs and experiences that are unique. Yeah, it's just it brings about that sense of exploration and mystery, which I think is also a very significant underlying point about hiking. Is it's like actually going into nature like this is exploration, and it kind of like tickles those kind of feelings, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a very spiritual feeling you get. I think you have a very carnal feeling that's like you're kind of what you're meant to do in some ways. I think that like it's spiritual, it's carnal. It gets your explorative side. You feel like you're navigating. And I think it even touches like, I think it's proven that being in nature makes you less depressed and can cure feelings of depression or anxiety. And I think that it's relaxing. And there's just so many benefits to going outside. I mean, I don't even think that it's worth me mentioning all of them here. I think for hiking in the 20th century, we talked about the big stuff that we think is really interesting. There's obviously a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot that we didn't cover. And we're going to be covering some of that in future episodes in smaller bites. Like we'd like to do a whole episode on the Sherpas. But I think I want to leave with my thoughts just on something positive. And that's to say that hiking in the last like 30, 40 years, one of the things I like is there's not really a lot of gatekeepers in hiking. There's not people that say like, oh, this is only for these kinds of people. There's not really a lot of gatekeepers that I've found in hiking. It's a very loving community. When you go out there, everyone says hello. Everyone welcomes each other as long as you have proper etiquette. And I think that the hiking outdoor companies are also very responsible compared to a lot of other industries. They do a lot to help conservation efforts. Like I know Fjallraven tried to do a lot of work with the EU to protect the Arctic fox population. And I think it's just an amazing movement that everyone should try to participate in some way.
Yeah, for sure. With that, I would like to kind of end with a quote by Teddy Roosevelt. So I think I'd like to read that.
Cool.
All right. So there is a delight in the hardy life of the open. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Pixel Meditations. We hope you enjoyed the episode as much as we did. If so, please support us and help spread the word so we can reach new listeners. You can do this by simply subscribing to our podcast, leaving us ratings and reviews on your favorite podcast apps, and by sharing our content. Your feedback and ideas are very important to us, so please get in contact with any requests, comments, or suggestions. You can find us on Twitter at Pixel Meditation, Gmail at thepixelmeditations@gmail.com, and Facebook at the Pixel Meditations page.